Her ex took everything in the divorce, but what he didn't know was that the one thing he left her, a worthless patch of land, held a secret her father had hidden there years ago. A secret that would change her life forever. If you've ever felt like you've lost it all, if you've ever had to start over from nothing, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're going to talk about what it means to rebuild, and I promise, you're not alone in this. The last box was taped. It wasn't even a full box, just a few paperbacks, a chipped mug, and a framed photo of my dad and me at a county fair, his arms slung around my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun. Everything else, every single thing that had made this house a home over the last 6 years, was gone. It had been itemized, appraised, and allocated. Mark had been meticulous. He was an accountant, after all. Meticulous was his brand. I ran a hand along the marble countertop in the kitchen, the one I'd picked out, the one I'd agonized over for weeks, weighing the merits of Carrara versus Calicut as if it were a life-altering decision. It felt cool and indifferent under my palm, a slab of expensive stone that no longer knew me. The whole house felt that way. It was a stranger's house now, scrubbed clean of my presence. The air smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and emptiness. The echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floors was the only sound, a hollow percussion counting down my final minutes. 2 years. 2 years of mediation, of legal threats disguised as polite emails, of watching the man I had promised to love for a lifetime dismantle that promise with the cold precision of a demolition crew. He'd called it an equitable dissolution of assets. I called it being erased. He got the house. He got the savings. He got the investments, the art, the car I drove every day. He even got the dog, arguing that Chester was emotionally bonded to the property. The property. That's what our home had become. An asset. I walked into the living room, where a pale rectangle on the wall marked the spot our wedding portrait used to hang. We looked so young, so sure of ourselves. I had loved him. I think I had, anyway. Or maybe I had just loved the idea of him, the idea of the life we were supposed to build. A safe life. A predictable life. My father had never trusted him. He counts everything, Clara, Dad had said once, stirring sugar into his coffee at my kitchen table, his gaze distant. A man who counts every penny is a man who's afraid of not having enough. And that kind of fear makes a person do selfish things. I dismissed it then, defended Mark, called my dad old-fashioned. Now, the memory was a shard of glass in my chest. My father had been gone for 3 years, a sudden heart attack that had stolen him before I ever got the chance to tell him he was right. I was left with a settlement that felt more like a severance package from a life I'd been fired from. He'd left me one thing, the one thing Mark's lawyers had dismissed as a liability. A small, 2-acre plot of land with a dilapidated cottage in a town called Havenwood, a place I hadn't seen since I was a kid. It was my dad's only real inheritance to me, signed over on my 18th birthday. Mark had wanted me to sell it years ago, but I'd refused. It was the last piece of my father I had. It's a teardown on a postage stamp, filled with black mold and asbestos. Mark had sneered during one of our last, ugly conversations. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you. But fine. Keep your precious shack. Consider it my gift, his gift. The thought was so bitter it made my mouth water. I picked up the single box, the keys to the cottage digging into my palm. The key ring was old, a worn leather fob with the faded logo of a hardware store that probably didn't exist anymore. This was it. The sum total of my life, postmark. A box of scraps and a key to a ruin. I didn't look back as I closed the heavy oak door for the last time. I didn't allow myself the luxury of a final glance at the manicured lawn or the rose bushes I had planted. I just walked to my beat-up sedan, a temporary loaner from a sympathetic friend, and drove away, the silence in the car a heavy blanket. The drive to Havenwood was 3 hours of gray highway and spitting rain. It was a journey from the clean, geometric suburbs to the soft, decaying heart of the countryside. The farther I got from the city, the more the trees crowded the road, their branches heavy with wet leaves. The world outside my windshield grew older, slower. Havenwood wasn't so much a town as a crossroads with a post office and a gas station that still had a bell that dinged when you drove over the hose. I remembered it from childhood summers, the smell of cut grass and distant cows, the taste of lukewarm soda from a vending machine. It felt like a different century. The cottage was worse than I remembered. It was set back from a gravel road, nearly swallowed by overgrown blackberry bushes and flanked by two skeletal-looking oak trees. The paint, once a cheerful yellow, was now a peeling, leprous gray. The porch sagged in the middle like an old mattress. A single shutter hung from a window by one hinge, knocking gently in the breeze. It looked exactly like what Mark had called it, a liability. I pushed the key into the lock. It was stiff with rust, and I had to jiggle it hard before the tumblers finally gave way with a reluctant groan. The air that rushed out to meet me was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time, of damp wallpaper and mouse droppings. Inside, it was a museum of abandonment. A layer of dust covered every surface. The furniture, what little there was draped in white sheets, creating ghostly, slumped shapes in the dim light. In the center of the small living room was a single wooden crate, my father's name stenciled on the side in black paint. Franklin James. It was the only thing in the room not covered. My settlement papers were in my purse. I pulled out the thick envelope and dropped it on the dusty crate. Inside was the final decree and the deed. The legal language was dense, impenetrable. It all boiled down to this. Mark got the life we built, and I got this. This forgotten cottage on 2 acres of forgotten land. I sank onto the edge of a sheet-covered armchair, the springs crying out in protest. A wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight washed over me. This was my new beginning. A dusty room, a sagging porch, and the ghost of my father. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I just felt empty, hollowed out. My eyes landed on the envelope again. The deed. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the crisp legal folds. It was a standard quitclaim deed, transferring the property from my father to me. But stapled to the back was a folded, hand-drawn map on yellowed drafting paper. I'd never noticed it before. Mark's lawyers must have missed it, or more likely, dismissed it as more of my father's sentimental junk. It was a survey of the 2 acres, drawn in my dad's familiar, precise hand. The cottage was marked with a small square. But behind it, at the far edge of the property line, he had drawn another, much larger rectangle. It was labeled simply, the mill. I didn't remember a mill. I remembered a field, a tangle of woods, a creek where I used to catch tadpoles. But a mill? I stood up, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light slanting through a dirty window. I walked to the back door and peered through the grimy glass. All I could see was a wall of green, a jungle of weeds and thorny vines that seemed to have been growing unchecked for decades. My dad was a builder, a man who worked with his hands, who understood foundations and load-bearing walls. He wasn't a man for sentimental junk. If he drew it on a map, it was there. Suddenly, the emptiness inside me was replaced by a flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet. Just curiosity. A question mark in the suffocating fog of my defeat. What was the mill? And why had I never known it was there? The back door groaned open, its hinges screaming like tortured animals. The air that hit me was damp and earthy, thick with the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves. The backyard was a formidable, churning sea of green. Blackberry canes, thick as my thumb and studded with vicious thorns, had woven themselves into an impenetrable hedge. Nettles and wild grapevines choked everything. It wasn't a yard, it was a fortress of neglect. I could see why Mark and his lawyers, and frankly, even I, had never bothered to look past the cottage. The property seemed to end at that wall of thorns. But my father's map said otherwise. It showed the property extending another 100 yards back to the creek that formed the rear boundary. And somewhere in that mess stood the mill. I went back inside and rummaged through a closet, finding a pair of my dad's old work gloves and a rusty pair of garden shears. It felt like arming myself for battle. The leather of the gloves was stiff but molded to my hands as if they remembered me. The first hour was brutal, punishing work. I clipped and sawed at the blackberry canes, which fought back, snagging my clothes and scratching my arms. The shears were dull, and my hands, soft from a life of keyboards and kitchen sponges, quickly grew sore and blistered. Sweat dripped into my eyes, mingling with the light drizzle that had started to fall. It was mindless, repetitive labor, and I welcomed it. For the first time in months, the frantic, looping thoughts about Mark, about the divorce, about my own failure, went quiet. There was only the snip of the shears, the tearing of vines, and the steady, rhythmic burn in my shoulders. Every few feet, I would uncover another piece of the past. A rusted wheelbarrow with a disintegrated tire. A line of moss-covered bricks marking a long-forgotten garden path. A child's toy truck, its red paint faded to a dull pink. It was like an archaeological dig of my own forgotten childhood. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the worst of it. The dense wall of thorns gave way to a small, shaded clearing. And there it was. It wasn't just a mill, it was a monument. It was an old feed mill, 3 stories tall, built of dark, weathered wood and corrugated tin. Its roof was peaked, with a large cupola at the top where grain would have been hoisted. A massive, rusted water wheel was fixed to one side, its paddles thick with moss and ferns, dipping into the shallow, fast-moving creek that ran alongside it. The building was in a state of arrested decay. It was clearly abandoned, but it wasn't falling down. It was solid, broad-shouldered, and stubborn, like my father. The wood was silvered with age, but the beams looked straight and true. Most of the windows were boarded up, but one on the ground floor was broken, a dark, gaping mouth. I circled it slowly. It was far larger than I'd imagined, taking up a significant portion of the back acre. A faded sign was still barely legible above the huge sliding doors on the front. Havenwood Feed and Grain. This wasn't just a shed. This was a commercial building, a substantial piece of property. My heart started to beat a little faster. How could this be here? How could it be part of this tiny residential plot? It made no sense. Unless my father had made it so. I approached the broken window, my boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. I hoisted myself up and peered inside. The interior was vast and cavernous, far bigger than the cottage. The air was cool and smelled of dust, old grain, and something else, something dry and sweet, like hay. Giant wooden hoppers and chutes snaked down from the ceiling. A complex web of leather belts and iron pulleys connected massive, silent machines. Light streamed in through gaps in the roof and walls, illuminating swirling columns of dust like spirits in a cathedral. It was silent, save for the drip of water somewhere and the cooing of pigeons high up in the rafters. In the center of the main floor, a small, glass-paned office was built against one wall, like a captain's bridge on a ship. Its door was closed. I dropped down through the window, landing softly on the dusty concrete floor. My footsteps were muffled. The scale of the place was overwhelming. It felt sacred, like a church dedicated to forgotten work. I walked toward the office, my hand trailing along the side of a giant grinding machine. The iron was cold and pitted. I could almost hear the ghosts of the place. The rumble of the machinery, the shouts of men, the dusty haze of milled corn. I tried the office door. It was locked. Of course it was. I peered through the grimy glass. It was a simple, utilitarian space. A heavy oak desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, and a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. And on the desk, placed squarely in the center, was a metal lockbox. It was the same kind of box my dad used to keep important papers in. I felt a jolt, a current of electricity that ran from the base of my skull down my spine. This wasn't an accident. The map, the locked office, the box. This was a message, a breadcrumb trail left for me to follow. I looked around the floor and found a heavy iron pry bar leaning against a stack of empty grain sacks. It was heavy, but my adrenaline-fueled strength was surprising. I wedged the end of the bar into the doorframe next to the lock. I put my whole body into it. The wood groaned, splintered, and then with a loud crack, the jamb gave way. The door swung inward with a low moan. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the pry bar still in my hand. The quiet of the mill seemed to deepen, as if holding its breath. I stepped inside the office. The air was even more still in here. I walked to the desk and ran my hand over the lid of the lockbox. It wasn't dusty like everything else. It had been wiped clean. It was waiting for me. I lifted the lid. It wasn't locked. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, were 3 things. The first was a thick stack of $100 bills, bound with a simple rubber band. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than I had to my name. It was survival money. The second was another deed. It looked different from the one for the cottage. It was a commercial deed, printed on heavier paper. It listed the feed mill as a separate property, with its own parcel number and a detailed survey. It was signed by my father, but the grantee section, the part that named the new owner, was blank. It had never been filed with the county. He had bought the mill and then legally, on paper, made it disappear, folding its description into the deed for the residential cottage land. A legal sleight of hand. A magician's trick. My ex-husband, the meticulous accountant, had reviewed the cottage deed. He had seen a 2-acre plot with a worthless shack. He had not seen a 3-story commercial building with its own unfiled title. He had counted the pennies and missed the gold mine hidden in plain sight. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. My dad had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. The third item in the box was a thick, sealed manila envelope. My name was written on the front in his unmistakable, blocky handwriting. Clara. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. This was it. This was the answer. I sank into the dusty office chair, the springs squeaking in the immense silence of the mill. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled out a sheaf of pages, covered in my father's writing. It was a letter, and as I began to read, the ghost of my father began to speak. My dearest Clara, the letter began. The ink slightly faded, but the handwriting as strong and steady as I remembered him. If you are reading this, it means a few things have happened. It means I'm gone, and it means you found yourself in a place where you needed to find this. I'm sorry for both. I wish I could be there to hand you this box myself, to wrap you in a hug and tell you it's all going to be okay. But life doesn't always deal us the cards we want. I had to stop and take a breath, my vision blurring. I could hear his voice in the words, that low, calm rumble that had always made me feel safe. I wiped my eyes on the sleeve of my dirty jacket and continued reading. I bought this old mill the year you were born. It was a wreck even then, shut down for a decade. The town thought I was crazy, but I saw good bones. I saw a foundation that had held for 50 years and would hold for 50 more. I spent a few years patching the roof, reinforcing the main beams, just enough to keep it from falling in on itself. It was my secret project. My folly. He went on to explain the legal trickery. He'd been a contractor. He knew the ins and outs of county clerks and zoning laws. He'd purchased the mill and its small parcel, and then, when he bought the adjacent land with the cottage, he'd paid a surveyor a little extra to absorb the mill's legal description into the residential deed, while keeping the commercial title separate and unfiled. It was a gray area, legally dubious, but not strictly illegal. It effectively made the mill invisible to anyone just looking at the property records for the cottage. Why, he wrote. Because I saw the way the world was going. Everything getting slicker, faster, more disposable. People, marriages, promises. I worried about you, sweetheart. You have my heart, but not my hard edges. You trust too easily. You believe in the best in people, even when they haven't earned it. It's the best thing about you, and the thing that scared me the most. My throat tightened. He was talking about Mark. He had seen it, all those years ago. He had seen the potential for this exact heartbreak. I never liked him, Clara. I'm sorry to say it so plainly now, but I have to. I saw the way he looked at things, at you, like assets on a balance sheet. A man like that will always protect his bottom line first. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was. But I've always believed in insurance. This mill, this is your insurance policy. It's your do-over button. I looked up from the letter, my gaze sweeping across the vast, silent space. The towering machines, the intricate systems of pulleys, the sheer, solid presence of the building. It wasn't just a building. It was a plan. A father's desperate, secret plan to protect his daughter from a future he could only guess at. There's some cash in the box, the letter continued. Enough to keep the wolves from the door for a few months, pay the taxes, get your feet under you. The deed is yours to do with as you please. The property is zoned commercial, grandfathered in. A developer would pay a fortune for this land, right here on the creek. You could sell it, take the money, and start a new life anywhere in the world. No one would blame you. You could walk away from Havenwood and never look back. I could feel the weight of that option. The clean break. The financial freedom. Everything Mark had taken from me, and more, handed back in one clean transaction. It was tempting. So tempting it scared me. But, he wrote, and I could feel the shift in his tone, the lean in, the lowering of his voice. There is another option. This place was once the heart of this town. It employed 24 people. Farmers depended on it. It was a place of work, of sweat, of purpose. It was a foundation. You could rebuild it. Not as a feed mill, maybe. The world doesn't need that anymore. But as something else. A brewery, a marketplace, artists' lofts, a community center. Something that puts a heart back into this town and back into you. It would be hard. Harder than anything you've ever done. It would be dirty and frustrating, and it might fail. But it would be yours. You wouldn't be an asset on someone else's ledger. You'd be the one building the ledger. I leaned forward, my elbows on the desk, the letter trembling in my hands. The dust motes danced in the light, and for a second, they looked like sparks from a welder's torch. I don't know what you'll choose, Clara, and it doesn't matter. Either choice is the right one, as long as it's your choice. All I ever wanted was for you to have a choice. To have a foundation of your own, one that no man could ever take from you. This place is built of old-growth timber and river stone. It's strong. It's lasted this long. So have you. You have good bones, kid. Don't ever forget that. All my love, Dad. I let the pages fall to the desk. And then I cried. I cried for my father, for the love so fierce and prescient that it reached across death to save me. I cried for my own stupidity, for the years I had wasted on a man who saw me as a liability. I cried for the girl who had believed in fairy tales and the woman who now stood in the ruins of one. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen, the tears washing paths through the grime on my cheeks. When the tears finally subsided, a profound, aching quiet settled over me. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut. But for the first time in 2 years, it wasn't alone. Beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of something else was starting to sprout. It felt like purpose. I sat in that dusty office for hours, just breathing. Breathing in the smell of old wood and forgotten grain. Breathing in the silence. The choice my father had laid out before me felt monumental, a fork in the road of my entire existence. Sell or build. Run or stay. The easy way out, or the hard way in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a harsh, alien sound in the stillness of the mill. I almost ignored it, but the caller ID was a number I recognized with a lurch of my stomach. Mark's lawyer. My hand hesitated over the screen. I knew I shouldn't answer. Nothing good could come of it. But a new, unfamiliar defiance was hardening inside me. I answered the call. Clara, said the smooth, condescending voice of Mr. Henderson. I trust you're getting settled. I'm fine, I said, my own voice sounding flat and distant. Good, good. Listen, a small matter has come to our attention. A bit of an oversight in the settlement, perhaps. We've been contacted by a party interested in the industrial potential of the land parcels adjacent to your cottage. My blood ran cold. How? How could they know already? I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I think you do, he purred. A little birdie mentioned an old mill. An unrecorded asset. Mark is, shall we say, very interested in ensuring that all marital assets were divided equitably. He feels there may have been a material misrepresentation on your part. The audacity of it stole my breath. He had taken everything, and now he was coming back for the crumbs he thought he'd missed. The fear I had lived with for 2 years began to curdle into a hot, bright rage. There was no misrepresentation, Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Mark called it a worthless shack on a postage stamp. His words, the settlement is final. Settlements can be revisited in cases of fraud, Clara. Hiding a commercial property is a serious matter. Mark is prepared to be reasonable, however. He's willing to let you keep the cottage free and clear if you sign over the deed to the extraneous structure. It was an ultimatum. A threat wrapped in a legal bow. Given the mill, or he would drag me back into the hell of court, bleeding me dry until I had nothing left. The old me would have buckled. The old me would have panicked, given in, done anything to make the conflict go away. But the old me was sitting in a house that no longer belonged to her. The new me was sitting in a dusty office, my father's letter on the desk, and a pry bar at my feet. Let me be very clear, I said, and the strength in my voice surprised me. You can tell Mark, and I'll use small words so he'll understand, that he can go to hell. This property is mine. The settlement is done. If you contact me again, it will be through my lawyer. I hung up before he could respond. My hand was shaking, not with fear, but with a wild, surging adrenaline. I had stood up to them. I had finally pushed back. The silence that followed was different. It was charged, electric. The choice was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was urgent. Selling felt like surrender. It felt like letting Mark win, letting him chase me away from the one thing my father had left to protect me. Building felt like a declaration of war. It felt like planting a flag. That night, I didn't sleep in the musty cottage. I dragged an old canvas tarp from a corner of the mill, shook it out, and laid it on the office floor. I used my jacket as a pillow. The money from the lockbox was tucked safely in my purse. Lying there in the dark, listening to the creek gurgle outside and the wind moan through the high rafters, I felt more at home than I had in years. The ghosts of the mill didn't feel threatening. They felt like witnesses. The next morning, I found a small diner in town. The coffee was strong and hot, and the waitress, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor named Betty, refilled my cup without me having to ask. I sat in a corner booth with a local phone book, a thin, flimsy thing, and a notebook. I looked up lawyers. There were only two in Havenwood. The first was a flashy ad for personal injury. The second was a simple, one-line listing. Abernathy Law. Real estate and estates. I called the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Abernathy, my name is Clara James, I said. I need some advice about a property deed, Franklin James's girl? The voice asked, and I was taken aback. You remember my father? Of course. Frank was a good man. Stubborn as a mule, but a good man. Said you might call one day. Come on by. I'm above the hardware store. Mr. Abernathy's office was exactly as I'd pictured it. It was cluttered with stacks of books and papers, smelled of stale coffee and old paper, and had a window that overlooked Havenwood's sleepy Main Street. He himself was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and suspenders holding up a pair of rumpled trousers. He looked more like a farmer than a lawyer. He listened patiently as I laid out the whole story: the divorce, the cottage, the discovery of the mill, the unfiled deed, and the phone call from Mark's lawyer. I handed him my father's letter, and he read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and polished them with his handkerchief. Frank was clever, he said, a small smile touching his lips. Always was. What he did wasn't exactly by the book, but it's defensible. The mill was legally absorbed into the residential parcel description before your divorce proceedings began. Your ex and his high-priced shark signed off on the settlement with that deed. It's a binding contract. They can make noise, they can threaten, but reopening the settlement would be an uphill and very expensive battle for them. They're blowing smoke, hoping to scare you. The relief was so immense it made me dizzy. So it's really mine? As far as the law is concerned, that mill is as much yours as the nose on your face, he said. He leaned back in his chair, which squeaked loudly. Now, the real question is, what are you going to do with it? Frank mentioned two options in his letter. I don't want to sell, I said, the words coming out before I'd even consciously formed them. I want to fix it. Abernathy studied me for a long moment. That's the harder path. That building needs more than a coat of paint. It needs a new roof, new windows, plumbing, electrical. It's a monster of a project. And this town, it's not exactly booming. You could sink every penny you have into it and still end up with a beautiful, empty building. I know, I said. But it's mine. And my father believed it could be something. I want to try. He nodded slowly, a look of respect in his eyes. That sounds like Frank talking. All right then. First things first. We need to file this commercial deed, officially separating the mill as its own taxable property under your name. It'll protect it from any further legal nonsense and get you properly registered. Then you need to talk to a structural engineer and an architect. And you'll need a crew. A good 1 inch. He scribbled a few names and numbers on a notepad. This is Earl. He's a retired contractor, knows that mill better than anyone. He worked there as a boy. And this is the number for the town planning board. You'll need their blessing for any new use. I took the piece of paper. It felt like a battle plan. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, he said, waving a hand. Pay your bills on time and prove your father right. That'll be thanks enough. I walked out of his office and into the bright afternoon sun, the piece of paper clutched in my hand. For the first time, the path forward wasn't a terrifying, dark void. It was a list of tasks. It was a series of steps. It was work to be done. I drove back to the mill, but I didn't see a ruin anymore. I saw potential. I saw the strong, straight lines of the beams, the honest texture of the old wood. I saw my father's faith in me, made tangible in timber and stone. That afternoon, I started the real work. I opened up the huge sliding doors on the front of the mill, which took all my strength, flooding the cavernous space with light and fresh air. I bought a push broom, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, and a pair of work boots. And I began to sweep. It was a ridiculously small gesture in the face of the monumental task ahead, but it was a start. I swept away decades of dust, of chaff, of the droppings of birds and mice. I swept away the feeling of neglect. With every push of the broom, I felt like I was clearing out the dust and decay from my own life. I was making a clean space. I was preparing the foundation. I worked until my back ached and my hands were raw, even through the gloves. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light through the dusty air, I stood in the center of a small, clean patch of concrete. It wasn't much, maybe 10 feet square, but it was a start. It was my patch. That night, lying on my tarp on the office floor, I didn't feel lonely. I felt occupied. The mill was no longer just a building. It was a partner. It was a promise. And I was finally ready to keep it. The first few weeks were a blur of hard, physical labor and bureaucratic hurdles. I met with Earl, the retired contractor Mr. Abernathy had recommended. He was a wiry, sun-weathered man in his 70s with bright, intelligent eyes. He showed up at the mill in a dusty pickup truck, took one look at me, and said, "You're Frank's kid, all right." You've got his stubborn jaw. He spent 2 hours walking through the mill with me, tapping on beams with a hammer, peering into the dark corners of the basement, and climbing a rickety ladder to inspect the roof supports. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding how buildings breathe. "She's hootin', but she's not dead," he finally pronounced, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. "The foundation is stone and solid as the day it was laid. The main timbers are old-growth fir. You couldn't buy wood like this today for $1 million. But the roof is shot. You're getting water in, and water is the enemy. That's your first job. Before you do anything else, you save the roof." He gave me the name of a local roofing crew he trusted and a ballpark figure that made my stomach clench. It would take more than half of the cash my father had left me. It was a terrifying leap of faith. But Earl looked me in the eye and said, "You can't build a future on a leaky roof, kid." So I made the call. While I waited for the roofers, I continued the Sisyphean task of cleaning. I filled dozens of trash bags with debris. I shoveled out piles of moldy, solidified grain from the bottom of the hoppers. It was filthy, exhausting work. Some days, the sheer scale of the project would overwhelm me. I'd sit on an overturned bucket, covered in dirt and sweat, and wonder if I was insane. Mark's voice would echo in my head, mocking me. A teardown on a postage stamp. But then I would look at my father's letter, which I kept in my pocket, its edges now soft and frayed. Or I'd catch a glimpse of the solid, massive beams overhead, and a fresh wave of determination would wash over me. This was real. This was mine. The people of Havenwood started to take notice. The diner waitress, Betty, would pack me an extra biscuit with my coffee. The guy at the hardware store started giving me a contractor's discount without me asking. One afternoon, an elderly woman I didn't know pulled up in her car. She rolled down the window and just stared at the mill for a long time. "My grandfather helped build this place," she said, her voice raspy with age. "It's good to see a light on in there again." She drove away before I could respond, but her words stuck with me. I wasn't just fixing a building. I was rekindling a memory for the whole town. The roofers were a godsend. They were a team of 3 hard-working guys who swarmed over the building like ants, tearing off the old, rusted tin and rotten decking. For a week, the mill was a cacophony of hammers, saws, and shouted instructions. I paid them every Friday with the cash from my dad's lockbox, the stack of bills dwindling at an alarming rate. But as the new, gleaming metal roof began to take shape, I knew it was the right decision. The first time it rained after the new roof was on, I stood inside the mill and just listened. There were no more drips. Only the gentle, drumming sound of rain on a solid roof. It was the sound of safety, the sound of a future. With the building secure from the elements, I could start to dream about what it could become. I spent my evenings in the cottage, which I had cleaned and made habitable, sketching ideas in a notebook. A brewery seemed too complicated. Art lofts felt too niche for a town like Havenwood. But the idea of a market kept coming back to me. A place where local farmers could sell their produce, where artisans could sell their crafts, where people could gather for coffee or a meal. A place that, like the original feed mill, could be the heart of the community again. I took my sketches to the town planning board, a group of 3 stern-looking, middle-aged locals who held their meetings in the back of the firehouse. I was terrified. I laid out my vision, my voice shaking slightly. I talked about my father, about the mill's history, and about wanting to create something for the town, not just for myself. When I finished, the room was silent. Then, the chairman, a burly man named George who also owned the gas station, cleared his throat. "Frank James was a good man," he said. "And this town could use a shot in the arm. I like it. We'll need formal plans from an architect, of course. But speaking for myself, I think it's a damn fine idea." A wave of support rippled through the small room. My little project was becoming the town's project. That night, a letter arrived at the cottage. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a simple, handwritten note on plain paper. There was no return address. "I heard what you're doing," it read. "I was wrong. Good luck." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. My friend, the one who had loaned me her car. She was also, I now realized, the little birdie who had told Mark's lawyer about the mill. She had been my friend, but she was closer to Mark's circle. The note wasn't an apology, not really. It was a confession and a release. It was the last thread connecting me to my old life, and it had just been snipped. I didn't feel anger. I just felt free. The work continued. I hired a young, ambitious architect from a neighboring town who fell in love with the building and agreed to draw up the formal plans for a reduced fee. I used the last of my father's money as a down payment. I was broke again, but it was a different kind of broke. It wasn't the broke of emptiness. It was the broke of investment. It was the broke of hope. As the seasons turned, the mill slowly began to transform. The boarded-up windows were replaced with large, new panes of glass that flooded the space with light. An electrician spent weeks running new conduit, and one magical evening, I flipped a switch, and the entire cavernous interior was illuminated by clean, bright light. Plumbers laid new pipes, connecting the mill to the town water supply for the first time in 60 years. Each step was a small victory, a testament to the power of just putting one foot in front of the other. I learned to use power tools. I learned to frame a wall and hang drywall. My hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. I was tired every night in a way I had never been before, a deep-in-the-bones exhaustion that was satisfying and clean. I wasn't just rebuilding a mill. I was rebuilding myself. One day, Earl stopped by with an old, framed photograph. It showed the mill in its heyday, probably in the 1940s. A line of trucks was waiting to unload, and a group of men in overalls stood on the loading dock, smiling for the camera. "That's my dad," Earl said, pointing to a young man with a familiar stubborn jaw. "And that's me on his shoulders." He looked around the now bright, clean space, at the newly framed-in stalls for the future market. "Your father would be proud, Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "You didn't just save the building. You saved its spirit." I stood there, looking at the photograph, and then around at the work that had consumed my life for the past year. The sunlight streamed through the new windows, illuminating the honest wood of the original beams. It wasn't a palace. It wasn't a monument to wealth. It was something better. It was a foundation. My foundation, built not on a man or a marriage or a promise from someone else, but on the love of a father and the strength of my own 2 hands. The road ahead was still long. There were loans to secure, vendors to find, a business to run. But for the first time since I'd walked out of that empty house, I wasn't afraid. I knew what it felt like to lose everything. And I had discovered that sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what's truly yours. This story, my story, isn't really about a divorce or a hidden inheritance. It's about what happens after you hit rock bottom. It's about looking at the rubble of your life and finding a single, solid stone to build on. For me, it was this mill. For you, it might be something else. A forgotten passion, a neglected friendship, a hidden strength you never knew you had. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. It means the world to me. These stories matter. Your stories matter. In the comments below, I want you to tell me about a time you had to rebuild. What was the one thing you held on to? What was the foundation you built your new life on? I'll be reading every single one. Because this space isn't just about my story, it's about ours. It's a community for people who have been through the fire and are learning to build in the ashes. If that's you, please subscribe and join us. You are not alone. And the best part of your story is the part you haven't written yet.